The idea that I would take whatever slipped through the cracks of Bree's integrity, I think is such a disappointment to who I see myself as now and who I wanted to be then. And especially when we view that in the oneness of marriage, Bree and I share a sexuality. It's not my sexuality, her sexuality anymore. I don't get to enjoy my sexuality apart from her.
Well, friends, welcome to this week's episode of The Boundless Show. This is Lisa Anderson here with you. Okay, here we are for our roundtable. We are also back this week with our dear friends, Bree, Trevor, and Jeff. Welcome back, you guys.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, those of you who listened to last week's show, know that we are in a conversation on sexual integrity, purity, honoring God with our sexuality, and including, what that looks like as far as sin in sexual decisions, what that looks like as far as hopefulness for how we walk this out, how we trust God in the process of being hopeful for relationship and beyond. And so we had a really great start to this conversation last week. I would say it was kind of hard. It was like, me saying, hey guys, put it all on the table and talk to us about, your fears and failures and whatnot. But hang with us, y'all, because we're going to actually tread into some very hopeful areas and practical areas today and this week. So be excited. But I want to pick up from last week in talking specifically about why we feel that it is so difficult, even in a church context, to admit sexual sin, sexual struggle. Why, of all the places where grace should be evidenced and Jesus should be seen, why is the church in particular such a tough place? Jeff, why don't you kick us off here? Because I know we were talking about this last week too.
Yeah, in my experiences, talking about it with any staff member is where it becomes most difficult. Some peers, though, as well. I think I've had a couple difficult conversations with friends and stuff just based off of assumptions of things, and I've had to put my foot down pretty hard. And it's anyway that could go a number of ways, but I think an important thing is. Last week I mentioned how the church talks about sexual sin or even how it doesn't in a sense. And I think because it's idolized so much in just the topic in and of itself, I think it's almost like a inevitability. Like it's I almost expect it, but then if you get rapport with somebody, like I was getting spiritual direction from somebody for a long time, and that when this topic was brought up, the response was just awful, and it's like, and I just thought we were having a conversation, and I'm putting it on the table. I'm just trying to say, here's where I'm at, if I'd said anything else outside of extremes, it would just kind of be like, oh, okay, well, how can we work through this or that? But when sexual sin gets put on the table, and it's like, oh no, we need to fix that. Yeah. And it's like, well, okay.
It's kind of like that old Bob Newhart sketch. Stop it.
Stop it. Stop it.
But it makes me wonder if, especially with a pastor, in a shepherding role, if there's a certain amount, and this might be something they have to entrust to the Lord, a certain amount of fear of this person is in my care and I am responsible for saying I'm making the sign of the cross, the right thing. I have to say the hard words. I have to say something, or it might be assumed that I'm being too soft on sin, or I'm being too, and so that is, part of me wonders of just okay, let's start a training course on how to have these conversations. Yeah. Because again, I think it could get really tricky, which brings me to ask you guys, everyone here, what would be your hopes for having these kind of conversations in the church? Because I can tell you, I don't know the last time in my church that sex, let alone sexual sin or whatever, was mentioned from the pulpit. I don't know. There are precious oldsters in my church who maybe haven't had sex in 50 years. And so they're just like thinking no one is. I don't know. No one that I know is really talking about this, unless Brie and I was talking about it, unless you're like in some young marrieds group where it's like, we better talk about porn because we don't know, we probably better, go there or whatever. But what would this look like for you if you guys felt like, man, I could come to church and we could actually have this conversation and it would be very discipling of me and others?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge need for accountability in this area. And I think that if we were to start conversations like this, it would do a lot of normalizing for people. I mean, especially like I had a group when I was in college where it was the first time I had ever had a conversation with somebody about masturbation. And I was like, oh, you struggle with this too? I thought I was the only one. And I think that we need to have more conversations with that because we are sexual beings, because we are all sinners. We need to acknowledge our sin. We need to confess our sin because that's ultimately how, like, if we bring it into the light, it can't have a hold on us. Like if it's in the dark, it's going to fester and it's going to wound us. But if we bring it out into the light, the Lord's going to take that and he's going to offer a lot of grace and forgiveness. I mean, even in our case, I mean, we've expressed in last week's show our own sexual experiences, but you can see Trever and I have an incredible marriage, and it's despite our pasts and despite what we did before, there is no shame in that. There's been forgiveness and grace, and we've navigated that together, and by the grace of God, we've forgiven each other and the Lord's forgiven us. So there is life on the other side of sexual sin, but it comes with conviction. It comes with you making different choices and pursuing purity, even in marriage. And I think that in the church, we could do a better job of saying, you are a sexual being, and that's a good thing. God made you that way, and that is good. And then 2, this is how you can use it well. This is the context in which it's appropriate. This is the context in which it's not. And ultimately, like, if you're on the same page with God in that if you save it for the covenantal marriage, it can be beautiful and it can be so safe and so secure. And I hope that the people listening to this really walk away with, we're encouraging you to not do what we did and instead to buy in, to be different, and to recognize that, like, oh man, if you just believed that what God has for you really is what's best, it really is what's best. I don't know how to say it any differently, but
yeah. And just a little bookmark to that too. I think what you're saying in expressions of sexuality that aren't sexual intercourse, there are conversations around that. Like there are nurturing elements to someone's sexuality. There are protective elements to using your sexuality. I know we've had Brant Hansen here on the show before in his book, The Men We Need, where he talks about like, guys, it's like you're not just some wilting wallflower until you get married and then you're like this hunting beast or something. There are ways to evidence how God has made you in so many different ways. And you can pursue marriage in very healthy, God-honoring ways, and you can pursue singleness in those ways and walk it out. And so I think it is, much more holistically, we need to talk about that.
And even if you just, I'm gonna take the easy route here.
Okay.
But if we were even
we'll
to
see if we let you, but go ahead,
that's fair. If we were to sit with the question of how is my riz or my aura actually an expression of my sexuality? And how am I using those to be worshipful or to glorify God? That alone changes the way that we're having this conversation, because there's an energy that you have that drives you in a certain direction, but it's not the role of the believer to be driven by our desires and our wants. It's our role to drive our desires and our wants, to be in control of our tongues, to be in control of our bodies, to seize hold of that. And I think that this is one of those places where, regardless of if you're single or married or whatever, it doesn't actually matter. Acknowledging that part of you and asking yourself the question of how am I using it in this moment? How am I using it in this week? will really start to change that conversation, because then we're outside of this, okay, don't have intercourse.
Yeah.
And we're even away from the question of like, how far towards intercourse am I allowed to go
Right.
before I'm in a bad place?
Right.
Because we start to realize that question alone says that you're in a bad place.
Well, and owning your feelings and your impulses and your body, and I'm saying this with the caveat of God owns it all, so let's be theologically correct in that, but that is operating from a position of strength, and I don't think we talk about that enough. We so often talk about, from what we've seen in shows and movies and elsewhere, of just doing what's easiest and man, we have the opportunity to craft a narrative as believers that is so countercultural in this area. And I think it's just, again, I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. It's pretty rad. And it is something that we can lead in and be. Don't even laugh at me, Jeff.
I mean, Trevor just said Riz.
Yeah,
I did.
It says over
and
here saying
aura,
rad.
which okay,
Yeah.
what in the world? What are we talking about here?
Farming all day.
Okay.
I want to touch on something there, because even in my relationship with Bree, when we were dating and engaged, I look back on that now with a great amount of disappointment for myself, because I was trying to be the good, godly fiance and to be like, God's first, and I'm going to lead you in the way we should go, and all of the things that we commonly hear in the church that die off after like 2 years somehow. Not for everybody, I'm being facetious, but I think when I look back on our sexuality, what I see is me grabbing hold of whatever opportunity existed and putting Bree in a position where she was the one holding the boundaries and holding the integrity of our relationship. And I was the one actually undermining it, even if I wasn't actively trying to. The idea that I would take whatever slipped through the cracks of Bree's integrity, I think is such a disappointment to who I see myself as now and who I wanted to be then. And especially when we view that in the oneness of marriage, Bree and I share a sexuality. It's not my sexuality, her sexuality anymore. I don't get to enjoy my sexuality apart from her or outside of the context.
Yeah.
And I think that includes when I go to Chipotle, what does flirting with the person giving me rice look like to get more rice? Because let's be honest, you can.
Okay.
But I think it informs that of what are the ways that Bree and I are comfortable with those sort of interactions? What does it look like to do that in this oneness of our shared sexuality and to both be upholders of the integrity rather than one person holding the line while the other person is just waiting for something to slip through.
Right. Well, and it's saying not what can I get away with, or what will this person, what even will God let me get away with? I think people say that too. And Bree, to your point about like doing everything except intercourse, I think a lot of people use that matrix to say, well, I think God didn't, there's not a chapter and verse on this. So I think I can get a pass there. I think that's very good to say, like, man, how are we walking this out as co-heirs with Christ, who ultimately will be with him forever and will be, again, we're still in a broken world. We have to admit that. That's true, but that's not our ultimate destination.
Well, and I think that was one of my main misconceptions, is that I didn't identify those other things as sex, or it was never expressed that way. And so I didn't think I was really crossing the boundary line. I knew that it probably wasn't great and that it was probably designed for marriage, but it wasn't defined as sex, so I didn't think it was bad. With the boundary lines, I know oftentimes when we talk about boundaries, I always feel like I bring up the same picture of like when your parents are protecting you from a hot oven. I think if you are really honoring the boundary line, you are believing what they say to be true. So if my parents say, hey, that oven is hot, don't touch it, you'll get burned, and I actually stay away from it, I am trusting that if I touch it, I will get burned. But in the case of sexual boundaries, it seems as though society feels like, or a lot of Christians feel like, God is setting up this boundary, but we're not believing him that boundary is worthwhile. We're saying, I am going to get as close to it as I can because I'm not trusting you that if I touch that boundary, if I cross that boundary, that it's actually going to bring me harm or that the earth will swallow me whole.
That's really good.
So that actually brings me to my next question, which is an opportunity for, us to just get real. What is still hardest for you all about sexuality and your own sexuality to entrust to God? Where are you still fighting him, would you say? What is it? What is that? Everyone's just like,
I feel like Jeff's eyes roll.
Exactly. We're all like, yeah, look away. Lisa
Don't make eye
might
contact.
Lisa might call on you.
Are we still
no.
alive?
Yeah. Exactly. Like what's hard? I mean, in this broken world.
I think as a married man, it is taking ownership of my own integrity in that and the sanctity of my sexuality within the covenant of marriage. But I think also there's a role of protecting others and holding integrity for others too. My kids as a dad being protective of what is appropriate and inappropriate, teaching them what's right and wrong and why. I think that those are really nuanced, really hard, really uncomfortable conversations that I have to lean into. But I also feel like if you're in a position of leadership within the faith and you're not willing to dive into those uncomfortable places, there should probably be a question about your position in that, because it's sort of the same as saying, yeah, I'm leading in all this sort of way, but I'm just not going to talk diet ever. I'm not going to talk about speeding ever. It's just not something we talk about. I think there's this weirdness to separating it out.
Yeah, I like that. Whether single or married, I'd say, like, just being from a male, and some of the things that you just said, Trevor, about kind of having almost like a natural protection type of a leadership role and such. I think based off of things we've already said, the expectations feel pretty heavy on the guy. And so I resonate a lot with what you said about being almost kind of willing, like if something slipped through the cracks, be like, oh, well, okay. Like I felt that way at, I don't know how many times. And I don't know how much that relates, those two things, but with conversations with, whether pastors or like other mentors of somebody that I was like, while I was dating somebody, inherently I don't disagree with the guy. I mean, at some point it's like when somebody gets married, you talk about head of the household, right? But we don't really ever get taught those things. And then this topic comes up and it's just like, oh, boom. And we're like, wait, what dropped? Like, when did that start? And it's like, oh, when you were born. Like, oh, okay.
Thank you. Timing to tell me
thank
now.
you.
I gotta pick it up if someone dropped it.
That was a while ago. Okay.
Yeah.
And so that pressure is just kind of there. And I don't, like, generally speaking, I don't mind being that person, but it would be nice to know, or would have been nice to have known that was not only expected, but more importantly, in what way do I operate, other than just, well, you're just leading in this way. And it's like, well, women can be pretty enticing, whether they realize that or not. And it's like, I don't mean it's the other person's fault by saying that, but it's like we're fighting so many things culturally about being equal in every way. And then we get to topics like this, and it's at least like from a church perspective, and then all of a sudden it immediately seems to divide, at least from my experiences. And it's like, well, that's a lot of pressure and not really any, there doesn't seem to be much of a constructive way to get through that, other than just like, well, we just simply need to fix it. And the only other thing I would add to it is, I think from a cultural standpoint, the biggest problem that I see that leads here, I shouldn't say biggest problem, but one of the much, much larger ones, is the idea that we've created dating as humans. And that just delays all of these, it delays getting married. Yeah. And so if 8 months, I mean, I think 8 weeks.
You can't just pluck
8
a
weeks,
wife out of a field
yeah.
somewhere and go,
Yeah.
Or if
you
your
have to
parents
do
it for you.
Yeah,
Right,
right.
right.
You can't go to a well,
Right.
like, and just water someone's camels. Okay. Okay. Got it.
But, and it's like, as much as I like dating, but we don't know any different. That's what we've all grown up with. And as much as it's fun to do those things, it's like, well, I mean, a year, yes, it's normal to us culturally now, but like, think just even back to biblical times, let alone just, you can take a random time, 700 AD, and it's like, you met somebody, and it's like, you came back from war or the field, and you're like, well, who's this?
Mm-hmm.
And like, how long do you think they waited?
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
to like make something happen,
Right.
you know? And in today's world, somebody, let's say you do slip, as we do all know people somewhere in our circle where somebody got pregnant and then they got married, or they got engaged. As long as the engagement thing happened, then it was kind of like, okay, well, let's move forward. Which I understand. There's no point to shame that scenario, but I feel like there's like, because we're not willing to address the dating part of things very much, there's this huge like gap in the topic where it's like, we're just expected to operate the same way. I get it, but we're not being really given much tools of any kind.
Right.
Let alone really I think even the most important thing would just be, I understand. Just to hear that
Yeah.
from a pastor, from staff and stuff, because they get it.
Right.
But it's just kind of, I think it just,
Or here's what the Bible says.
Yeah, and
here's
it's
what
like,
that
well,
means for dating, even though that didn't exist
Right,
there.
right.
Right.
And it's like,
That's
well,
the
Yeah.
whole role of a pastor most of the time in all these other subjects.
right.
Well, and
yeah.
it's so fluid, because you know that for most people, if you're going to go to college and get a 4-year degree, you pretty much are putting in 4 years. If you're going to date, you might put in 4 years and then that relationship implodes and you're starting your degree all over again. And so I think to that point for singles who are like, and no one's going to say, I can give this 2.5 years and then I pretty much need to be having sex. I mean, but people think that because you have this timeline. You can't just say, and there's hopefulness in that just for the relationship in general. I'm not making it all about sex, but this idea that how long do I have to wait for something that is very good and God ordained, marriage, a relationship, to be to be giving in this? And it's like it's a moving target, because anyone can end that relationship and you might be left holding the bag, and it can be very frustrating and sad. And this person is now walking on the earth and you thought there was a potential relationship there or potential marriage, and there's not. And so I think that, Jeff, is good to bring up in terms of the sadness that can be felt around that, of hopes that are not realized. And again, and then you're working with a real timeline too. I'll put this out there on behalf of singles. I remember thinking when I turned 30, I will never be married in my 20s. And that was a loss that I had to grieve, because time marches on. And you might be in your 30s and looking at 40 and saying, am I going to have to see my 30s in the rearview mirror? And this has not been realized, because again, this is not entirely your decision. There is another person involved here, and there is God involved here. And you cannot single-handedly decide that you will be married by 24 and a half, and it's going to work out in the way that you want it to. And so I think that's really helpful. I think too, and I'll just say this, I don't think this is like an elephant in the room. I probably could have said it at the get-go. I think there is also this general idea, especially among singles, even Christian singles, that if I get to my grave not having had sex, I am less of a person. God has forgotten me. I am men, there's masculinity that plays into that, the conversations around that, I think there's a lot of inherent shame that's in this conversation. And so I think it is okay to acknowledge that and to grieve that and to go to God with that, because that is something that only He can solve. And the feelings around that and the wounds around that, I think is important for us to call out. So that said, I do want to give, we're going to finish up here, but Bree, I do want to give you the chance, because you have been very aspirational and hopeful in your conversation around marriage and what marriage is, and why, despite your on-ramp messes, which you've acknowledged, how you've really had some realizations in marriage about why God has it the way he has it and what he said in his word. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. Well, living within the confines that God has set forth, there is a lot of beauty. I think specifically with regards to marriage and sex within marriage, it's this idea that there is safety and security, and that if I make a mistake or if I do something dumb, Trevor's not going to divorce me because of that. He's not going to leave me. It's not like a relationship where it's like there really is nothing here holding us together. And if I had an embarrassing moment, then I'm out of this relationship. Mm-hmm. It's also like it's us working together to figure out what makes sense for us and for our family and for like what's enough for you, what's not enough for you. And also the freedom to like try things because sex is weird. It really is. And
I think too, it feels like a canvas we're both getting to paint on, where we both get to express something and it gets to be safe and appreciated and affirmed. And there's this, I think, especially as a single man back in the day, there was so much of a performative element to sexuality and such a pressure of you have to perform in a certain way. And I don't think anybody in this world has actually really told me what that performance is supposed to look like, right?
People try.
It's
but,
so
you know,
dependent and all of that.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of guessing like, am I doing enough? Am I good enough? All of this stuff.
Yeah.
In marriage, that's not the goal any longer. And you actually get the acknowledgement in health of, yeah, that was great. This is wonderful. I like this. All of those things that you're looking for, or at least I can speak from my experience, that I was looking for in those past relationships and did not get.
Yeah.
Right? There was always this sense of like, I think so.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But longing for that affirmation, and then in marriage to actually feel like that's the thing that's being filled and not being pressured for either is really beautiful.
Yeah.
There is, I mean, it's so cool to see as a person on the outside looking in. What I see and what I'm assuming is there is so much more to your relationship than sex.
Yeah.
And I think that
bit.
is what, yeah.
Love
But I
it.
think, you know, because we talk, you know, here at Boundless, Brie and I, we talk all the time to single young adults who, I mean, I speak at colleges. I've spoken at secular colleges where young adults, college students are hooking up because they would rather get drunk and have blackout sex than actually have a conversation with someone or need to be known by someone, because that is the risky part of a relationship. That is the hard part, to be the person, like Bree said, who's like, I can mess up and my husband will be okay with that. Yeah. And even if I mess up in a sinful, even if I sin against him and offend him, we can have a conversation about that, and there can be repentance and there can be renewal in that. Right. That's the holistic picture of what relationship is and what we're called to, that is so much beyond like we're just having sex.
Well, I told Bree when we were engaged that I would marry her even if we never had sex. And I think that's more true now than ever, because it really is, I mean, it's a meaningful part, but it can become pretty insignificant in the light of life. And I think that a lot of the way that we put this pressure on sexuality, it has to be this huge thing all the time. It's really not.
Yeah. And it's a service to one another. I mean, there are times where like when you have a baby, you like the doctor tells you to wait 6 weeks before you have sex again.
Minimum.
And minimum. And it might take longer. And the husband has the opportunity to serve his wife in abstaining from sex for that time period to love and serve her. And I was going to say too, you had mentioned vulnerability. Sex is super vulnerable. It's so vulnerable. And if people are unwilling to be vulnerable in their emotions and in conversation with people, why are they so vulnerable in being able to be naked in front of somebody else? Like, I don't understand. That's a discrepancy in my mind of like, I'll be naked with you, but I won't talk to you about how I'm feeling.
Yeah. Well, and which is again, and we got to finish out here. But again, I think that is so helpful because you guys are talking as a married couple who I know both of you have friendships, relationships outside of your marriage. And that vulnerability has to happen. Again, we cannot just stare our eventual partner in the eye and think that they're going to meet every one of our needs. First and foremost, we get our identity through God himself and who he says we are and who he is and the relationship we have with him. That is important. And to realize that, again, that vulnerability, it's not just like, hey, be some kind of, psycho. And then when you get married, you're going to get fixed by having this perfect relationship with someone. No, we are all called to relationship. We're called to vulnerability. We're called to service and sacrifice, whether we are single or married. And we have got to lean into that. And then those of us who are still single, if and when God gives us a marriage partner, we will be that much healthier, that much more whole, that much more. We've got to bring it all to the table. Okay, as we finish here, I want to say something in closing out because I want to talk about this. You guys have been so helpful in this. I say often that, I think it was Martin Luther who I heard first say it, that the root of all sin is unbelief. Because I think we want to make sexual sin about just like, oh, you're just dirty, you just like sex, whatever. Usually our hearts have to be given somewhere and we are trusting something. This is why we have idolatry, people, and it's not just about little carved wooden things. Ultimately, if the root of all sin is unbelief, we sin because we don't take God at his word. We don't really believe that he's good. We don't really believe that he cares about us and has good things for us. We don't really believe that he can be trusted with our lives and even our hearts. So we can talk about cultural problems and pressures all day, but in the end, we're responsible before God for our obedience, even in the things that are hard, that don't make sense, or when we're the only person on the planet who seems to care. And I want to encourage everyone listening, including us at the table, that we have got to humble ourselves and entrust our whole selves, even our sexuality, to a God who loves us and created us and knows more intimately than anyone does or will, even ourselves, what we are about and what we need. And so I want to encourage you, those of you who are encouraged by this, discouraged by this, wherever you're landing here, you have got to go out and start having these conversations with people who want to have these conversations along with you. This might be a friend. It might be a pastor, if you can find one who's safe. It might be a professional counselor, therapist. But go after this and figure out that you are going to be the person leading in this space, even if no one else is, because we have got to start trusting God. If we say that we trust God, let's trust him. Let's lean into this. Let's understand that he is big enough to handle our struggles and our sins and our pasts and what we're thinking we're going to do next weekend, whatever. Okay. So let's walk in this. And I think that Trever, Bree, and Jeff, you've done a great job of opening the door for folks to have this conversation and start thinking about this. So thank you, you guys. I really appreciate it. Awesome. Okay, guys, as we finish out this segment, I want you to know that maybe this start is by you talking to someone even here at Boundless and Focus on the Family in our counseling department. They are willing to give you a complimentary consultation about something you might be struggling with right now. So if you go to Boundless.org/counseling, you will see a bunch of resources there as well as contact info to get a hold of one of our counselors for this consultation. And the cool thing about it is we have an entire list of vetted counselors across the country who are equipped to maybe give you some continued care right where you are in your town or city. And so make that available to yourself if that's a call where you can reach out and make that happen. So boundless.org/counseling, and you can get the help there. So thanks again, you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.